In the blood-soaked winter of 1184, as samurai armies clashed on the plains of Awazu, one warrior rode ahead of the entire vanguard. This warrior didn't just fight. They decapitated enemy commanders with a single sword stroke while galloping at full speed. They shot arrows that found their marks between the eyes of fleeing soldiers. They inspired such terror that opposing forces would scatter at the mere sight of their approach. Contemporary chronicles recorded this warrior as being worth 1,000 ordinary soldiers. Here's what makes this impossible. This unstoppable force wasn't a man. Her name was Tomoe Gozen, and she was a woman in 12th century Japan, an era we've been told had no place for female warriors. But here's what they don't want you to know. Tomoe wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a centuries-old tradition of female samurai called onna-bugeisha, warrior women who fought alongside men, commanded troops, and defended castles. And the reason you've never heard of them reveals something far more sinister about how history gets written, rewritten, and deliberately erased. By the end of this story, you'll understand why an entire warrior class of women was systematically removed from Japanese history and what it took to bring them back. This isn't a legend. This is the true story of the woman who proved that the deadliest samurai in Japan didn't need to be a man. Our story begins in the province of Shinano, in the mountains of central Japan, sometime around the year 1157. Picture a landscape of steep valleys and rushing rivers, where mist clings to ancient cedar forests and wooden fortresses guard strategic mountain passes. This was the world of the Heian period's final decades, when Japan's imperial court was losing its grip on power and regional warlords were beginning to carve the country into their own domains. In one of these mountain strongholds, a girl named Tomoe was born into the household of Nakahara Kenido, a mid-ranking samurai serving the Minamoto clan. But here's what made Tomoe's childhood different from nearly every other girl in feudal Japan. She wasn't raised to arrange flowers, pour tea, or manage a household. She was raised to kill. The tradition of the onna-bugeisha stretched back centuries before Tomoe's birth. These weren't women who picked up weapons in desperation when their homes were attacked. They were trained warriors from childhood, learning the same martial arts as their brothers, mastering weapons specifically designed for their fighting style. While samurai men favored the katana, onna-bugeisha became lethal with the naginata, a curved blade mounted on a long pole that allowed them to use leverage and technique over raw strength. Imagine the training grounds where young Tomoe learned her craft. Dawn breaking over mountain peaks as she practiced 10,000 strikes against wooden posts, the weight of armor being adjusted to her growing frame, the sting of practice arrows missing their targets until, through endless repetition, they stopped missing, the bruises from grappling training. The calluses forming on hands that gripped sword hilts and bowstrings. But Tomoe's training went beyond the physical. She studied strategy, learning to read terrain and predict enemy movements. She memorized the weak points in armor where a blade could penetrate. She learned to ride a horse at full gallop while wielding weapons in both hands. Most importantly, she learned something that would define her entire life, that excellence was the only acceptable standard, and that her gender was irrelevant to her capacity for greatness. Contemporary accounts describe Tomoe as possessing extraordinary beauty combined with terrifying martial skill. The historical text, The Tale of the Hike, records her as having long black hair, pale skin, and remarkably beautiful features. But here's the fascinating part. These same texts describe her in the next breath as being a fearsome warrior, able to handle even unbroken horses, and in battle she was worth 1,000 warriors, ready to confront a demon or a god, mounted or on foot. This wasn't flattery or exaggeration. By her early 20s, Tomoe had become one of the most skilled warriors in the service of Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a powerful warlord who was himself raised in the same Shinano mountains. The relationship between Tomoe and Yoshinaka remains one of history's great mysteries. Some sources suggest they were lovers. Others indicate she may have been his foster sister, raised in the same household. What's undeniable is that Yoshinaka trusted Tomoe with his life, elevating her to the position of commander and keeping her by his side in every major campaign. But to understand how Tomoe would become the most famous female samurai in Japanese history, we need to go back to the catastrophic civil war that was tearing Japan apart. The year was 1180, and Japan was beginning to fracture along ancient fault lines of power and ambition. For nearly 4 centuries, the Terra clan had grown wealthy and powerful by aligning themselves with the imperial court in Kyoto. They controlled trade routes, collected taxes, and filled government positions with their relatives. To much of Japan's warrior class, the Terra had become soft, more courtiers than samurai, dressed in silk while real warriors bled in the provinces. The Minamoto clan, once nearly destroyed by the Terra decades earlier, saw their opportunity. Under the leadership of Minamoto no Yoritomo, they began rallying provincial warlords to their cause. What followed was the Genpei War, a 5-year conflict that would reshape Japan and establish the samurai as the nation's ruling class for the next 700 years. Yoshinaka, Tomoe's lord, was one of Yoritomo's cousins, commanding Minamoto forces in the mountainous regions of central Japan. And riding at the head of his army, commanding troops and leading charges, was Tomoe Gozen. Picture this, a battle formation of several thousand warriors, bristling with spears and banners, horses stamping nervously as commanders shout orders. At the vanguard, positioned ahead of even the most elite samurai, rides a warrior in full armor, helmet adorned with flowing silk ribbons, controlling a massive warhorse with perfect precision. This is Tomoe, and she's about to demonstrate why Yoshinaka places her at the front of every engagement. What Tomoe created wasn't just a military career. It was a revolution in how women could exist in Japanese society, proving that the rigid gender boundaries everyone assumed were natural laws were actually just social constructs that could be shattered by anyone with sufficient skill and determination. The battles came fast and brutal. In 1181, Yoshinaka's forces clashed with Terra armies at the Battle of Yakutagawa. Tomoe commanded a unit of cavalry, leading charges that broke enemy formations. Historical accounts describe her shooting down multiple enemy samurai with her bow, each arrow finding its target with devastating accuracy. But here's the fascinating part. Tomoe didn't just fight from a distance. When enemy lines closed and the fighting became hand-to-hand combat with swords and spears, she excelled there too. Contemporary chronicles record specific instances of her prowess. At one engagement, an enemy samurai charged her position, thinking to take advantage of what he assumed was an easy target. Tomoe parried his sword strike, disarmed him with a technique that leveraged his own momentum against him, and then, in a move that became legendary, she grappled him off his horse and pinned him to the ground. What happened next was recorded by multiple sources. She removed his head with her sword in a single stroke, tied it to her saddle, and returned to formation as if she had merely dealt with a minor inconvenience. This wasn't just combat skill. It was a level of psychological dominance that most warriors never achieve. Tomoe fought without hesitation, without fear, and with a calculated brutality that made her presence on the battlefield worth exponentially more than her individual fighting capacity. Enemy soldiers learned to recognize her on the field and would actively avoid engaging her. Friendly troops rallied around her, fighting harder because her courage was contagious. By 1183, Yoshinaka's campaign was reaching its peak. His armies had cleared the Terra forces from the northern provinces and were now marching on Kyoto itself, the imperial capital. The Terra clan, facing defeat, made the unprecedented decision to flee the city, taking the child Emperor Antoku with them. In July of 1183, Yoshinaka entered Kyoto in triumph, with Tomoe riding beside him. But the real genius of Yoshinaka's campaign wasn't just military, it was political. By entering Kyoto first, before his cousin Yoritomo, Yoshinaka positioned himself as the leader of the entire Minamoto clan. He installed a new emperor, effectively making himself the power behind the throne. For a brief moment, the mountain warrior from Shinano stood at the center of Japanese power. Tomoe, throughout this rise, served not just as a warrior but as an advisor. Historical texts record her presence at strategy meetings, her voice being heard on tactical decisions. In an era when women of the imperial court wielded their power through indirect influence and manipulation, Tomoe's power was direct and undeniable. She had earned it through demonstrated competence in the most masculine domain imaginable, warfare. What no one could have predicted was how quickly triumph would turn to disaster. This brings us to the year 1184 and the decision that would transform Tomoe from a successful warrior into an immortal legend. But it would also lead to her disappearance from history and the beginning of a systematic erasure that would last for centuries. The year was 1184, and Yoshinaka's position was beginning to fracture from within. After his triumphant entry into Kyoto, everything started going wrong. His mountain warriors, unused to city life and frustrated by lack of pay, began looting. The imperial court, which had initially welcomed Yoshinaka as a liberator, now saw him as just another brutal warlord. Worst of all, his cousin Yoritomo, the nominal leader of the Minamoto clan, viewed Yoshinaka's independent power base as a direct threat. The crisis came from multiple directions simultaneously. The Terra forces, though pushed back, were regrouping in the west. The imperial court was sending secret messages to Yoritomo, begging him to remove Yoshinaka from Kyoto, and Yoritomo, seeing his opportunity, began moving massive armies toward the capital. But here's the fascinating part. Yoshinaka's real crisis wasn't military, it was political. He had won battles but failed to win the political game in Kyoto. His attempts to control the imperial court had backfired. His reputation as a mountain warrior who didn't understand courtly etiquette became a liability. The very directness and martial excellence that had won him victory in the field made him vulnerable in the snake pit of court politics. What Yoshinaka couldn't have foreseen was that his greatest threat would come not from the Terra enemies he had defeated, but from his own family. By January of 1184, Yoritomo had sent two massive armies toward Kyoto, commanded by his younger brothers Yoshitsune and Noriori. Yoshinaka suddenly found himself facing overwhelming Minamoto forces that outnumbered his own troops by a ratio of nearly 10-1. The situation deteriorated with shocking speed. In a desperate attempt to maintain power, Yoshinaka tried to take the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa hostage, a move that only confirmed everyone's worst opinions of him. His remaining allies began abandoning him. His army, which had numbered in the thousands, dwindled to a few hundred loyal warriors. But the real crisis was this. Yoshinaka knew he was going to die. The question was only when and how. If you're still here, this story is about to take a darker turn, because what happens next will show you exactly what loyalty looks like when there's no hope left, when the only choice is how you meet your end. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because the Battle of Owazu is where Tomoe Gozen transforms from a legendary warrior into an immortal symbol. So stay tuned. By late January, Yoshinaka's remaining forces had been pushed out of Kyoto. Yoritomo's armies were hunting him across the countryside. What remained of his army, now reduced to fewer than 300 warriors, was making a desperate retreat toward the province of Omi. They knew they were riding toward death, but they rode anyway, because that's what samurai did. Tomoe Gozen rode with them. While other commanders had abandoned Yoshinaka, while allies had melted away into the countryside to save their own lives, Tomoe remained at his side. She commanded one of the few remaining cavalry units, her skill and reputation worth 100 ordinary warriors. This wasn't just loyalty, it was a statement. Tomoe could have escaped. Her skill was so renowned that any warlord in Japan would have welcomed her service, but that's not what she chose. When Yoritomo's forces finally caught up with Yoshinaka's army on the 21st of January, 1184, at a place called Owazu in modern-day Shiga Prefecture, the outcome was never in doubt. Thousands of fresh troops against 300 exhausted warriors. But here's where the story becomes almost mythical in its tragedy and heroism. The Battle of Owazu wasn't really a battle, it was a last stand. Yoshinaka's remaining samurai formed up in a desperate defensive formation, knowing they were buying time for nothing, that there was no reinforcement coming, no strategic objective to achieve. They were fighting because warriors fight, because dying well was the only victory left available to them. And leading the initial charges, breaking enemy formations even as the noose tightened, was Tomoe Gozen. Let me explain why this matters, why Tomoe's actions at Owazu became the stuff of legend that survived even centuries of deliberate historical erasure. In samurai culture, how you died mattered as much as how you lived. A warrior's final moments defined their entire legacy, and Tomoe's final recorded actions were so extraordinary that they couldn't be erased, even by those who later tried. Picture the scene, a frozen winter battlefield, churned mud mixed with snow, the sky dark with smoke from burning arrows, bodies already littering the ground, the sound of thousands of warriors clashing, metal on metal, horses screaming, men shouting orders and battle cries. And in the center of this chaos, Tomoe Gozen on horseback, her armor splattered with mud and blood, still fighting with the precision and skill that had made her legendary. The historical text, The Tale of the Hike, records what happened next with remarkable specificity. As the battle turned into a complete rout, as Yoshinaka's remaining warriors were being cut down, Yoshinaka called Tomoe to his side. What he said to her has echoed through Japanese history for over 800 years. "You are a woman, so leave now. I have made up my mind to die here, either by enemy hand or by suicide if I am wounded. It would be unseemly if in my last battle it were said that Yoshinaka was accompanied by a woman." Here's where the story reaches its heartbreaking climax. Yoshinaka wasn't dismissing Tomoe because she was weak or because she had failed. He was trying to save her life, releasing her from the obligation to die with him. But for Tomoe, this was the ultimate rejection. After years of fighting beside him, proving her worth in dozens of battles, she was being told to leave because of her gender. According to the historical accounts, Tomoe refused to go. Yoshinaka had to order her repeatedly. And when she finally accepted that he wouldn't change his mind, she made a decision that would define her legend forever. She would leave, but first she would perform one final act that would prove, beyond any doubt, that her skill had nothing to do with mercy or special treatment because of her gender. Tomoe rode into the enemy lines one last time. She was looking for a worthy opponent, someone whose death would serve as her final statement. She found him, a warrior named Onna no Hakiro Morishige, known throughout the Minamoto armies as a particularly strong fighter. What happened next was recorded by multiple chroniclers. Tomoe charged Morishige, who was leading 30 of his own samurai. Visualize this moment, one warrior against 31, deliberately seeking combat when escape was available. The two warriors met in the chaos of battle. Morishige, confident in his reputation and seeing only a lone opponent, engaged. The fight lasted seconds. Tomoe grabbed Morishige, pulling him from his saddle with a grappling technique that showcased her devastating close combat skill. She pinned him across her saddle bow. And then, as enemy warriors charged to save their commander, Tomoe did what she had done dozens of times before. She removed Morishige's head with her sword, twisted her horse, and broke through the enemy lines before anyone could react. She rode away from the battlefield carrying Morishige's severed head, proof of her final kill. Behind her, Yoshinaka made his last stand and died, either killed by enemy arrows or by his own hand. The historical record is unclear. And then Tomoe Gozen vanished from history. For over 600 years, Tomoe Gozen was essentially erased from Japanese historical consciousness. Not completely, the stories were too powerful, the legends too persistent, but she was transformed from a real warrior into a romantic figure, a character in plays and poems rather than a serious historical subject. And the entire tradition of the onna-bugeisha, the female samurai warriors who had fought for centuries, was systematically minimized and forgotten. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate cultural revision that began in the 17th century and continued for hundreds of years. When the Tokugawa shogunate unified Japan in 1603, they began implementing rigid social hierarchies designed to prevent another era of civil war. Part of this system was an increasingly strict definition of gender roles. Women were pushed out of public life, confined to domestic spaces, their primary value defined through their relationships to men as daughters, wives, and mothers. The idea of women as warriors, as commanders of troops, as individuals who could achieve greatness through their own skill and courage, this became dangerous. It threatened the entire social order the Tokugawa regime was trying to establish. If women could be samurai, what other rigid categories might be questioned? So the onna-bugeisha tradition was deliberately forgotten. The naginata, once a fearsome weapon wielded by warrior women, was reframed as a woman's weapon, used only for household defense, stripped of its military significance. Stories of female warriors were reinterpreted as tragic romances or as exceptional anomalies that proved the rule rather than challenged it. But here's the most shocking part of this story, the part that most histories don't tell you. The erasure was so thorough that by the 20th century, most Japanese people believed that female samurai had never existed at all. They thought Tomoe Gozen was a myth, a fictional character from ancient literature, like something from a fairy tale. It wasn't until archaeologists began examining battlefield grave sites in the late 20th century that the truth started emerging. DNA analysis of remains from medieval battlefields revealed that a significant percentage of the bodies, between 5 and 30% depending on the battle, were women. These weren't civilians caught in crossfire. They were wearing armor. They had died from combat wounds. They were buried with weapons. The physical evidence couldn't be denied. The onna-bugeisha had been real. Women had fought in Japanese wars for centuries, and the historical record had been deliberately manipulated to erase them. Today, as we recover this lost history, we're not just learning about forgotten warriors. We're uncovering how history itself gets shaped by those in power, how entire categories of human achievement can be erased when they become politically inconvenient. Tomoe Gozen's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what else we might be wrong about, what other achievements and traditions have been deliberately forgotten because they challenge someone's idea of how the world should work. Her legend survived 600 years of erasure because it was too powerful, too specific, too well documented to completely destroy. But how many other women's stories didn't survive? How many female warriors, strategists, leaders, and innovators have been lost because their achievements were systematically removed from the record? The mystery of what happened to Tomoe after the Battle of Owazu remains unsolved. Some accounts say she became a Buddhist nun, finding peace after a life of war. Others claim she married a powerful warrior and lived quietly in the provinces. Still, other legends insist she continued fighting under different names, her skills too valuable to waste in peaceful retirement. We'll probably never know the truth, but perhaps that's fitting. Tomoe Gozen's power comes not from the details of her death, but from the undeniable fact of her life. She fought. She commanded. She achieved greatness in an arena that supposedly had no place for women, and no amount of historical revision could completely erase what she accomplished. Tomoe's legacy endures in every modern woman who refuses to accept limitations based on gender, in every person who looks at a system that says, "This isn't for you," and proves them wrong through sheer excellence. Her story, emerging from centuries of deliberate obscurity, reminds us that the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to bury it. Tomoe Gozen reminds us that greatness can emerge anywhere, from any person, regardless of what society claims is possible. And even the most magnificent achievements can be lost if we don't actively work to preserve them, to question the narratives we've inherited, and to dig deeper into the stories we've been told are complete when they're actually missing crucial chapters. If this story opened your eyes to how much history has been hidden or rewritten, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of human achievement. Let me know in the comments what other historical warriors or lost traditions you think deserve to have their stories told, because the truth is always more incredible than fiction. You just have to know where to look for it, and you have to be willing to question everything you thought you knew.